those are at Go Down Arts. Yes, thank you. And yes, welcome everybody. And we look forward to a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks too much, Nicholas. So yeah, I'm Connie Smith, and this is James Muriuki. We thought we'd start by just talking a little bit about the background to the exhibition and our collaboration, and then maybe get into some of the sites that feature in the exhibition and some of the themes that we've been trying to explore. So the title of the exhibition, Excavation, Elevation, really kind of sums up the kind of very basic but quite fundamental interest that I think we both have in our respective work. So I'm a social anthropologist by training and normally working with words, but now really happy to be doing some collaborations in the visual domain. James also works a lot on urban transformation, that she'll talk more about. So one of the themes of what I've been working on for the last couple of years is looking at Nairobi's high-rise transformation and thinking about what are the social, political and material networks and effects that transformation is grounded in. And as well as this kind of very rapid construction boom, high-rise boom that we're seeing all over the city, as probably most people here are also aware, there's also been this spate of collapsed buildings as well. So that brings in then these questions of the quality of materials, also the kind of networks of regulation and oversight and how that is working or not working. But it also brings to the fore, I think, when these very tragic events happen, then we really start to see kind of literally the insides of the buildings, but also the insides of the industry that produces it, right? That's when, the certain kind of stories come to the fore about where maybe these material networks, political networks, both overlap and then fragment and come apart. So thinking then about excavation elevation was really thinking about this very simple idea that to build up, you also have to dig down. And I think we're both interested in different ways in this kind of material manipulations that underlie high-rise growth. So this kind of literal excavation of foundations, the forms of excavation that go into quarrying, cutting stones that you can see around that we'll talk more about. And so you get these kinds of extractive processes that are very material, but there's also, of course, a kind of extraction in terms of value, capital, the ways that these very dense particularly rental neighborhoods, are very extractive places. So these are some of the themes that kind of brought James and I together. Do you want to say a bit about your interest in materials?
Yes, yeah. So my name is James Muriuki. I work primarily as an artist, but a lot of my work is very research-based. And for the longest time, there's so many strands of investigation that I was interested in. In my schooling, I was very interested in architecture, and because of that, then buildings, end up being of very strong interest to me as these sort of symbols or sort of monuments of human capacity and human sort of aspirations. And as you know, when I was growing up, we were always told about development, and the images that were presented to us were often images of very tall buildings, and the more artificial they looked, the more sort of developed that was meant to be. So my interest in buildings and the processes around building has always been there for many years. And then in the last, say, 5 or 7 years, I got my interest started narrowing down to very basic forms of things, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's, and because of my interest in architecture, then the basic form of what a building is became a very, a very special area for me to try and investigate and research what's happening in there. And that's when I started observing things like building stones, not only building stones, but rocks in general, timber, steel, all sorts of things, and including other matter that is not necessarily used for buildings. Started looking at other forms of architecture, whether it's human architecture or it's things like ants or birds, all sorts of what I'd call architecture. But for, I think for purposes of, investigation, then it became obviously much easier to look at sort of human architecture, if I may call it that. So collecting stones and bits of things and tools that people use was very strong for me. But then the second thing is also the connection that the human has with this material. So whether it's human hands, whether it's human mind, human thoughts and imagination, and also aspirations. Where do people get these ideas of buildings from? So when we started these projects, some of the early work we were doing is photography, looking at advertising, what is being sort of put to the public as an aspirational idea of what living spaces can be. Before COVID, there was a lot of billboards everywhere in the city that were advertising all sorts of buildings with all sorts of amenities, whether it's security, whether it's water, whether it's play areas for children, all sorts of things. But with that sort of image, aspirational image that was being presented, I think it became of interest to both of us to try and investigate. Okay, but what does that mean? How does that play out on the ground for most people? And so once we started photographing things like buildings, and even you probably saw one of the earliest images here. If you go downtown, you'll see people selling even architectural drawings. Like you just buy and go and implement. So stuff like that became very strong interest to us. So that's basically my background to getting to this project. And but then we were confronted by the question is, okay, yes, there's so much we can do around architecture and buildings, but where do we start? Where, how do we engage, not only spaces, but also people that are involved in spaces. And some of the early people that we interviewed or we met were people that Connie had worked with before in Kaloleni, Eastlands, that have been living there. Another whole area of research there. And then we came across a very interesting Instagram page that was looking at materials, posting images of material and sort of innovation that happens in the building sort of ecosystem. And that's how we got introduced to Jenga Group, who will be talking to you a bit later. And we went to see them to just to understand their work, what is it that they do, what are the things that interest them, and they gave us very, very, very useful connections in terms of thinking of about material, because they themselves think about material very heavily, and that's how we ended up going to quarries in Thika and thinking about other buildings in the city. So basically, that's the background to the project, as I say. But Connie, you might want to talk a little bit about your interest in material and failure of material.
Yeah, so I think through all of those different networks, one thing that we came back to a lot was the relationship between people and materials. So particularly in this context of building failure, building collapses, and this growing awareness that the systems of oversight and regulation are clearly not working in the way that they should for all kinds of complex reasons. So one thing we became very interested in is how do people make judgments and assessments about building quality, about material quality for themselves through using their bodies, and thinking about how behind these kinds of very smooth, sleek facades of new buildings, every brick is laid by hand, but even before that, every brick is touched by hand and even extracted from the quarry. So even when there are machines that are cutting the stone, which hopefully you'll see in one of the videos, in fact, the cutting might be done by machine, but in fact, all the quality control is still being done by human hands and also human senses. So using sound is an interesting one, color, texture, the way that things feel is vital for kind of doing these assessments of what is film quality. And this really interested me because I have this interest in thinking through what does failure actually look like and what are the systems that we have developed for ourselves to try and move around and negotiate this in different ways. So then we started thinking about also the life cycle of materials. So starting from the quarry, thinking about process of extraction, the movement of materials, particularly stone from quarries such as the one we visited in Thika, and thinking through, what are these are manipulations in terms of space, right? There's spatial extractive processes that are happening that are drastically shifting landscapes in one area outside the city in order to undertake this incredibly dramatic transformation now within the city. And I think once then we were visiting the quarry, we also were very much interested in the temporal aspects as well. So this is both a spatial manipulation, but also a temporal one, in the sense that these processes are very much intervening in a kind of geological time, right? So but by excavating, by digging down, we are sort of reshuffling, reconfiguring these geological layers that make up this part of the geography of Kenya. And then we've also got movement of sand and concrete and all these other materials. So then thinking through then, well, how do these kind of what seems like a very rapid transformation of the city, in fact, is engaging in these much, much longer temporal frames that go back millions of years, literally into the fabric of the earth. So maybe we should say a bit more about the sites that we completed.
Yeah. So one of the earliest sites we visited was Kino. So when Connie came out to now collaborate with me, okay, I probably need to mention about the process of collaboration. We both think that approaching ideas from different disciplines, I think, adds on to what knowledge that we can generate from from a certain field. So luckily we're working sort of in a very similar sort of subject in a way, but working on it from very different disciplines. And one of the ways that we could have done is Connie could have done research and come up with ideas. I could have done my own work independently, and then we present that. But we thought it would be just much more richer if we work together, if we collaborate together. Me sort of understanding her approaches and her looking at my approaches and seeing how we can merge those two ways of working. So Connie had to come out again to specifically work on this project with me. And before that, I'd shared quite a few images of billboards and other spaces that we could visit. And so while she was here, we thought, okay, we need to go to places where there's a lot of apartments, a lot of building apartments that we can just go and observe, because it's the process of observation that generates other ideas. That's where ideas come from, when you start observing and when you start being very deliberate about what you're engaging with. So actually, it was Pipeline that we went first. We went to this area, Pipeline. It's towards the airport, and it's just, I don't know how to describe it. It's super dense, not only with buildings but also with people and activity. It's very, however much sort of there's so many buildings, the human presence is so you feel it, as opposed to such spaces that might feel otherwise, where you see a lot of buildings, but the human presence is very limited. So in Pipeline, you'd have a lot of laundry hanging all over. So anyway, so we went to Pipeline, and just around the same time, a building collapsed in Kino. One of the apartment blocks collapsed, and we were like, well, I was going to say yes, but I can't say that.
Fortunately, it collapsed during construction.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
No one was in. Yeah. It was not occupied at the time.
So we thought, okay, let's just go to Kino and just be there and sort of talk to the neighbors, talk to the people around there, to talk to the police. And when we got there, obviously it's a condemned space. They say, oh, no access, is sort of security risk for people to get in. But we managed to speak to some people, to the engineers and all that. They say, oh yeah, just come in and have a look, So we met people who were sort of testing all the quality of concrete, We met some neighbors who just came to enjoy and view and sort of be part of that, I suppose, moment of transition of a city. But then interestingly, there's this young chap we met, well, not young chap, this man we met outside. He said, I know you, James. I met you at your exhibition at London. He happens to be a photographer. And he offered to sort of take us around the neighborhood the next week, and which was really, really very sort of revealing of the background to those transformation of those neighborhoods, where, as you read in your text, where the chambers start becoming this sort of concrete blocks. So that was very interesting to also observe where, when he was younger, where he'd go swimming, and everything has changed now.
Yeah, so I think also one of the things that came up strongly there was an element that he is the kind of public knowledge of these buildings. And so he actually straight up told us, in this neighborhood, I would never live in a building that's more than 4 stories tall, because underneath this area, there are all of these underground streams and rivers that are seasonal, and none of these foundations are adequate to deal with that kind of destabilizing. So we came back again to this idea of the kind of subterranean, the underground. We went to this place where he went swimming, and so we had this kind of sense of like a hidden watery landscape, that also another kind of watery landscape that entered into these spaces. And I think for us that was again coming back to these questions about what is visible and what is hidden in this situation, and what's inside the building, what's outside the building, but also what's underneath the surface, and what we see on the surface is only the kind of small element of these different dynamics that are going on.
And also, by just looking at the apartments, that we were also very keen to understand what happens on the inside of these buildings. And another area we visited, obviously, was Eastleigh. If any one of you has been to Eastleigh lately, the transformation there is just mind-blowing. So all sorts of flats, apartments, of multi-use buildings coming up. So we went to Eastleigh. It was quite difficult to get into some of the buildings, but we sort of managed to find our way up some of the buildings and sort of understand sort of what facilities are being offered there. Again, in terms of material, very interesting, very different from, say, what was offered in Oregon, the kind of finishes, whether it's the color of tiles, the quality of things, the quality of pipes, and what's in the rooftop. Luckily, another person that we know offered, like, look, we built this luxury apartments near Karura Forest. Do you want to come and see and visit? So we went to, I think they're called Motaiga Heights. We thought they were in Motaiga, but they are actually not. But, I think Motaiga View would be a better name. So we went there, looked at spaces like that. I mean, it was a whole lot of places to visit. And of course, that is looking sort of what is above ground, but we're also very keen on seeing what is below ground. And through the connections we got from Jenga Group, we went up to think a couple of times to just understand where the source of this material, where does this material come from? How do they judge quality? What is the price of things? Who is in charge of what? It's another whole ecosystem. So from observing what we can see above and go, start looking to look at what is below ground. Yeah.
And I think, that brought us then also, didn't it, to this question of how we look at very mundane materials that, everywhere you go around the city, you see piles of stones and gravel and sand, and we don't really think about how, every kind of aspect of that material has these kind of traces of human labour and human endeavour. So one of the things we wanted to do in making this exhibition was to try and maybe kind of slow down our kind of engagement with these materials and look more closely. So that's why we brought these stones from the quarry at Thika. And so we wanted to present them, and after this we'll bring them out and kind of we'll be a bit more on display, but to present them really as these sculptural objects in a way to kind of, coming back to this word elevation, to elevate them into a kind of object that you would look at more closely, like you might look at a sculpture, a piece of art, rather than, oh, these are Marwenti. And in fact, we had this really nice encounter when we were installing them, but when Ellen, the Askari here, he came over and he said, are these stones or is this art? And we were like, it's both. So we thought that was just really nice because it really got at this question of like, what is it that we're looking at and how do we look when we see these things and what do they feel like and so on. So
That's clearly art.
Yeah, should we talk about Upper Hill?
Yeah. How did you meet this man in Upper Hill?
Oh, okay, I'll start with that. So along the way of this process, about thinking about what the Nairobi's high-rise buildings look like, I came to hear about this project called the Pinnacle, which started quite a long time back and was intended to be the tallest building in Africa. And the site is located in Upper Hill, quite close to the British High Commission. And I was reading about this and thinking like, wow, this is interesting. This project launched a long time ago, but I've not seen any, where is it? Where is the tallest building in Africa? So I decided to go to the site with this man who's just coming in now, actually. So we went together to see what was going on. We found this very tattered billboard that's still there. And while we were there, I was feeling like, what's actually happening? The Askari of that came out and said, what are you doing? And we were thinking, oh no, we've been caught sort of lingering outside this building. And he said, oh no, come in, you can see it. There's, we have the foundations. And so we came in and really what was visible was what you can see in these images over here. So this kind of idea, this is the most dramatic example, I think, of this, to dig down, to go up, you have to dig down. And it really brought home again this idea of extraction. What's this kind of, in geological terms, what's the difference between a quarry and it digging out a foundation? There are both these very deep manipulations of the landscape. And so then when we went together, we became kind of interested in the ecological aspect of it as well.
And I mean, I've got history. I worked in the building next door there in Tuna Tower for 8 years. And from there, I was used to just observing this open ground below. And then all of a sudden, this area gets sort of blocked off and you cannot access, and then the rumors and the stories that it's going to be the tallest building in Africa. Again, this idea of development. Why is it important that it's the tallest in Africa? It's probably important, I don't know. But, it was quite interesting to see what is this very tall building that is coming. And of course, it's probably the shortest now. It's just like,
Negative.
But also, I suppose, going to the space, Upper Hill, I think it's Google was mentioning, has one of the most complicated rock structures, one of the hardest rock structures in Nairobi. I didn't know that. But just going to a hole, a huge hole, and observing the rock structures and sort of the texture that gives it sort of represents me, because I always have this feeling that everything comes to our senses. Whatever we end up feeling is is something that has been synthesized by inputs, whether it's what we hear, what we smell, what we touch. So again, just observing that sort of gives one certain feelings. And being in there, then we started observing that so many other things have developed in the space. So there's plant life now. There's later there'll be a video playing here. There's swallows that have treated that as their home. Apparently now there's fish in that crater now. Who introduced the fish, we don't know. Reeds and all sorts of a whole ecosystem has developed in the last 3 or 4 years now that crater has been there. But for us, I think just the idea of observing and taking note of what is happening, I think, is one iteration that we have done for this process, Yeah.
Yeah, I think it also brought us back again to this question of time, and that actually, left to its own devices when coming back around to this is the film. So yeah, this question of time about, these very drastic and huge human interventions, but then actually when they're stalled for whatever reasons, then we see these other forms of life coming into those spaces incredibly fast. And so it got us thinking then about, okay, this is urban changes, so it's happening so fast. These are kind of drastic anthropocenic changes that are really altering the world. But if we stopped, if humans weren't here in this space, then actually other kinds of ecologies come back in, birds, and stuff. So that question of how time and space are really enacted through the landscape.
Yeah. I think we should take a question or two and I'll get maybe these
Let's do
guys
questions
can
afterwards.
yeah.
So great, yeah.
Over the
What was that?
yeah. Thank you. I think you'll be lonely there.
I won't be that long.
You're okay. Okay, welcome. Oh, sorry. I think you're the best.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll
I
give it
can
to
introduce myself.
No, so on that, with that kind of background to the project, then and we already mentioned a bit that through this process of research and encounter that we were really delighted to meet with Kujenga Group and who are Nairobi-based architectural practice doing really interesting, innovative work with stone and lots of other materials. So we've spoken a lot about our very kind of personal encounters, so we thought it would be nice also to have another perspective on some of these issues. So we're really delighted to welcome Bashara from Kujenga Group, who's going to speak for a few minutes, and I think you have a
few slides to show.
Great, okay.
Well, thank you very much. My name's Bashara, and Knight's with me, and we are architects in Nairobi. And we met James and Connie through, I think, a shared fascination for stone.
Yeah.
So we have a very limited social media presence. I think we're very bad at that. But we put up some pictures of a visit to a quarry. And I think that prompted the discussion. And since then, we've had these kind of quite long conversations about stone, which would probably be very, very dull to anyone else, but fascinating to ourselves, I think. But so today, what I'll do is, if I can, just talk through about 13 slides of images that we think are interesting and relevant to the discussion of stone, and how they've perhaps shaped or molded some of the built history or the built environment of Nairobi, because I think it's quite a precise condition. James talked about Thika, and the reason why we were able to direct him to Thika was because we stumbled upon this pink stone quarry in Thika. That's about 20 kilometers, I think, away from the center of Nairobi. And it's quite remarkable to think that that exists in that condition, that you can access pink colored stone 20 kilometers away from the center of Nairobi, and that we don't see more pink buildings around Nairobi. This reminded us of Jaipur in India and Rajasthan, this beautiful pink stone. They built cities out of it. And so we discovered this stone, and one of the first buildings that we built was then built entirely out of this stone. And this quarry actually has an interesting history because it was disputed. It was part of, I think, the Salvation Army, and James, I think you know more about this. And the Salvation Army had access to this quarry and was excavating stone. And then many years later, there was this financial dispute over who owns the stone and who had right to access. And we like this particularly because you can see the tree growing above the rock. You can see the depth of topsoil, and then you see literally within a meter, you begin to reach rock. So I think this is a very powerful image which we use quite often. This image is of topography, and it shows African topography. And I think it's interesting to go back 25 million years. That's when the East African Rift Valley was formed, essentially through the divergence of two tectonic plates. The Arabian plate, which is kind of by the Red Sea, and then down to the African plate where you see this ridge of the Rift Valley forming. And so I think when we talk about stone, we've got to remember that this is, our discussion today is actually a function of tectonic activity that has been evolving and has been taking place for millions of years. The geologists, and I should say, by the way, I'm not a geologist, I'm not an economist, I'm an architect. And so I can't speak to the kind of technical aspects of this. But what I understand is geologists agree that one day part of East Africa might split off in the Somalian plate into the Indian Ocean, millions of years to come. But I think the tectonic activity has created the landscape that we live on. And when we talk about stone, it's a function of the fact that this activity has taken place, and it has led to the formation of Nairobi, which I want to come on to, which is where we've essentially come across a lot of the stone material across the city. So this is a photograph we took with an engineer who visited us from the UK, and he's an expert on stone. And it was a nice moment of a curio seller on the edge of the escarpment of Rift Valley, looking down over the Rift Valley, showing us his map that he'd drawn onto a piece of soapstone. And what's interesting is that it has these sort of icons within it, which begins to explain Mount Longonot and these are the features of the Rift Valley. But what belies that is actually quite a complex history of geology and tectonic activity and history. I mean, why are we in Nairobi today? Why are we in this particular location? And that comes back to, we think, the history of the construction of the Ugandan Railway, the accident that was the formation of Nairobi. And so you have this beautiful moment where he's explaining, this is the Rift Valley and this is Mount Longonot to a technical engineer. But there's this history of why we are where we are and what's been happening for millions of years. So I think we have to remember every time we drive along that escarpment, we're on the edge of this amazing part of East Africa, and the city was formed because we reached that enhanced elevation, that climbing altitude and topography. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, I don't think we should talk too much about history, perhaps, but there's some beautiful moments, and if you dig a little bit about the research that was done into the geology of Nairobi. And this is a report that was produced by the government, by one of the ministries in 1991. And the conclusion from the chief geologist is really amusing, because the conclusion is that the best potential for the rock that underlies Nairobi, the best potential is for building stuff. And that's amusing because if you think back to when the first geological survey that we know of was conducted, and that was in 1893 by a chap called John Gregory, who was a British geologist. And he had essentially graduated from a degree in geology. He was working at the Natural History Museum, and he was shipped out to Nairobi very quickly. And the cynic in me tells me probably for extractive purposes. This is 8 years after the Berlin Conference, and we know King Leopold had found lots of minerals in Congo, and the British had established British East Africa. So logic would suggest that let's go to East Africa and let's study the geology and find out what minerals lie in East Africa so that we can begin to extract. And the good news for us, 100 years later, is that they didn't find any minerals of value. Otherwise, we suspect we would probably live in a very different condition in Nairobi today. And so 100 years later, the conclusion of what underlies Nairobi is that actually there's a huge amount of stone that can be used for construction, for building. And that is one of our primary areas of interest in the material. And so going back to one of our favorite images of the construction of the Uganda Railway, this is Nairobi railway station in about 1900, thereabouts. And there's so much that you could speak to in this image of the time in which it was taken. And I won't get drawn into that, but what I will say is that Nairobi, as most of us know, was an accident. And during construction of the Ugandan Railway, so George Whitehouse, who was building the railway for the British government, decided that Nairobi would be an appropriate storage depot. And the reason why, and you're climbing about 1,000 meters of altitude, 1,300 meters of altitude by the time you get to Nairobi. There's now a twin engine on the locomotive to get up the escarpment. So Nairobi and so you have the geological tectonic history, which leads to the formation of the Rift Valley, the escarpment. You have many, millions of years later, so you have the establishment of British East Africa, the construction of the Ugandan Railway, and the accident that in building a railway, they needed to store materials and the city grew out of it. So whilst this is, of course, the ancestral indigenous land of the Kikuyu, the Maasai, and the Kamba community, literally a point at which the three communities meet. The city in 1900 is established because of topography. And what underlies that is the idea of stones and rocks that sit underneath the city. So I think that this is a present day Google Earth image of Nairobi. And what's interesting is that we look at Google Earth periodically. We try and study it just to kind of from the perspective of how is the city evolving. And there's a lot that you can say about this image. But what you can see immediately is that there's a divide between northwest, which is very green, and southeast, which is very dry. And the reason for that is the climbing altitude, the increase in topography. And that's why Nairobi is literally before it starts turning green. So you can see that history coming through in a Google Earth image today. And I think what's also interesting is that Nairobi is one of the highest altitude cities in the world. We sit at about between 1,500 and 2,000 meters. And that's similar to Kabul, if you think about it. And that's quite an amazing fact that we are actually situated so high up. And how I think from our perspective, the fact that this topography has influenced the development of the city. So the northwest is, for example, generally a higher value part of Nairobi, and that's because it's green, it's more temperate. And in its history, you can see that it was segregated historically. That's where you could live if you were European, for example, and if you weren't European, you lived in the southeast. And that evolution, that segregation, we think still stays today, but on socioeconomic lines. But its history comes back to the kind of the topography and the geological formation of Nairobi. So to come back to stone a bit more precisely, this is a survey that was conducted by the Technological University of Michigan in 2013. And what we've done is to superimpose the municipal boundary of Nairobi. And I say the metropolitan region, Nairobi is actually, we think, a much bigger city than that boundary. But that is Nairobi on top of the geological condition. And you can see these different colors represent different types of rock. And that's quite amazing because what it suggests that across Nairobi, you can essentially dig down within 1 meter, 5 meters, sometimes 20 meters, and you'll find rock. And up a hill you spoke of, we built a project where an excavation contractor thought that he'd be able to excavate the basement in 3 months. And he was quite close to State House. And what he realized is going to take him many more months than he thought because he had to painstakingly break the rock, which is incredibly hard. So underneath Nairobi, we have these different conditions of rock. And what's also interesting is that these are volcanic flows. So this is essentially generally lava flows that have cooled and then settled over time and become very, very hard rock. And the kind of stone that James is showing off these tractors, as they call them, cutting the rock, is volcanic ash, which is formed into a volcanic tuff. So it's a much softer kind of stone that you can cut very quickly. And that's what we see around Nairobi more generally. So I think to understand the fact that Nairobi sits on the edge of this escarpment, and that beneath Nairobi are layers of rock, is very important because that's how the city is developing in terms of its built environment or it being influenced by it. So this is a photograph of one of our desks in our office, and we pick up stone wherever we go to a quarry. And I think what's important about this image is that it shows you different conditions of stone and rock. Within 30 kilometers of Nairobi, you can access a plethora of color of rock, red, green, gray, yellow, and different textures and different consistencies and different strengths. When I last traveled to the UK, I took a suitcase of stone to be tested for compression strength because we weren't convinced by the results we were getting in Nairobi, and they were slightly different to what we get in Nairobi. But some of this stone is quite hard, it's quite strong. And what it means is that we can actually start to use the stone in a slightly different way to the way in which it has been done historically with these very thick mortar joints and how we can use color and how we can dress the stone. And I think it's very interesting when you talked about the fact that you have stone which is cut out of the ground, which has texture and color to it. And then we tend to plaster it and paint it. And we hide the story of the stone completely. And this photograph of our table shows you that actually we shouldn't be doing that. We should be celebrating it and we should be enhancing it to the extent that we can. We need to label that stone before I forget most of it. And so there were dozens of pictures that we could have chosen from. And they all have different connotations, but this is a picture of the construction of Nairobi School in 1930. What was then called the Prince of Wales School, which was built for, to quote, I think it was Edward Grigg, the governor, European children who needed first-class education. And he'd studied at fancy private school in England, and he thought it should be modeled upon those lines. But what's interesting in this photograph is how they built the school. Because if you look at this foundation construction, I don't think that much has changed in the last 100 years. What you've got is essentially blocks of stone which were cut into brick-sized pieces rather than larger-sized pieces that we looked at in James's photographs at the back of the row. And they were assembled into a foundation onto which a slab is cast and then the walls are erected. So that technology, that system worked 100 years ago, and it actually works pretty well now. And anyone who's built in Nairobi will probably have gone through a similar experience with their foundations being built. What's also interesting in this image is the stratification of the roles from the construction site in 1930. So we think you can see a foreman, who's probably European, standing in the foreground. Giveaway is the helmet. You can see an Indian labourer, we think, who's probably part of that group of indentured labourers that came to East Africa. And then you can see Wachwa Mkono, the casual labourers, which hasn't changed. The structures have changed, although the actors are slightly different today. So it's interesting that that construction methodology is the same, the material is the same, and that it still works quite well. And this is 100 years later. So going to images of quarries themselves, and again, there's hundreds of images that we could use, but this particular gentleman we met at a quarry was splitting quarry stone. And the way that these quarries work is that the tractors or the mechanized machines are slicing up the soft rock into what's called machine cut stones, which is what you see around Nairobi building walls. You can see it on the building outside. The rock that emerges below that is a much denser rock, and it's very difficult to cut with mechanized equipment, which is why you see this manual process of extraction. So we've tested the density of the stone, and it's quite strong. It's actually fairly strong. You can see that dynamite is used to break up the rock in a quarry wall, and the large boulders are then split using traditional methods entirely by hand. So I think there's also an idea of the human aspect of the quarry. And on the one hand, it's incredibly inspiring to see what's happening, but on the other hand, it's really upsetting because the conditions are not the best. People are working in the boiling hot sun, they're breaking rock, and they're doing it for a living, to make a living. But when you talk to them about mechanization of these quarries, what I've been told is that, well, if you bring mechanization to the quarries, we don't lose our jobs, our income, our livelihoods. So in our work, what we think about is how can we engage local quarry communities to continue extracting stone in the way in which they're doing, and to use that stone and these kinds of boulders in the construction of buildings, but to begin to celebrate color and texture and to create as much employment as possible. And the process on the left is from the quarry. On the right, you can see stone being dressed on the site and beginning to introduce texture into the blocks so that you can begin to convey the integrity of the materiality in the final outcome of the building. And I will very briefly, because I think this is one of the discussions we've had with Connie and James, talk about embodied energy. Because today, Africa as the continent produces about 3 to 4% of global carbon emissions. So that's, in global terms, that's nothing. The US produces 23%. The global shipping industry produces about 3 to 4% of global carbon emissions. But if you look at the changes that Nairobi is experiencing, look at the new expressway, built entirely out of concrete. That expressway has, I don't know how many tons of embodied energy within it. And I'm not getting into the discussion of whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, I'm just making an observation. And so when we look at the embodied energy in stone, concrete has 10 times more embodied energy in it than stone does. And just to give you an idea, aluminium, and you see these aluminium cladding panels coming around up Nairobi because, as you said at the beginning, they are associated with progress. Those panels have 400 times the embodied energy of the stone block. So as our city grows in decades to come, I think one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, what materials should we use? How do we use them? And what are some of the broader considerations to the environment? And I think the fact that you can get that range of colors within 30 kilometers of Nairobi, a meter below the ground, is an amazing opportunity. And some of our ideas in terms of our work, these are some of the realized projects that we've done, and they show different colors and textures of stone, where we've tried to build using the stone expressed so that you can see the pattern of the stone, the fissures, the texture, and cutting it, dressing it, using it in different conditions on windows, swimming pools, and fascias of buildings. So these are just some images to show you, yes, we extract stone from a quarry, but how we're also thinking about the way in which they are incorporated into a building. And the last slide I'll end with is a building not far from here called Vienna Court, which is an office building. And it relates to the first slide, which I showed you, which is the kind of the final result of that pink stone quarry. And this is 3 crescents of an office building that wrap around a pre-existing garden. And one interesting moment in this building is that when we finished it, a director of a leading paint company came to see it. And he looked at the building and he said, but it's all stone. And it's all got embedded color in it. It's pink stone. He said, there's nothing to paint. And that's good, because I think that when we have a building material that has the color to it, that is a beautiful color that can be celebrated, that's something that we should probably do. So just some thoughts, I don't know how well they connect, but to the idea of geology, history, stone, and some of the ideas that we've been looking at. Thank you.
Yeah, I think next week thing would be, thank you, Bashar, for that very informative presentation. A few new things from you also that I didn't know from before. But I think we'd love to take some questions now. Yeah.
Joy and Janet, you get to start.
Oh, okay. Yes, we'll take some questions and Joy, Janet.
Yes, I mean, we were only starting people off so that something could be started off. But I'm sure there's lots of questions, and now we've got heaps of students who've arrived. Karibuni. Yeah. I think always there's let me stand where people can sort of see me from both directions. Just many interesting aspects of both presentations and what's going on. I think the first thing is just picking up on this idea of the collaboration of the social anthropologist and the visual artist photographer, and the two of you very deliberately sort of saying, let's not do our pieces separately, but let's do this together. So I guess one of my first questions to you would be, what has that done for both of you in your practice in creating something together? What does this mean? Is it different from what you'd have created separately? So what are we seeing in terms of the researchers, social anthropologists, and the photographer who's been interested in photographing the city, but now looking at your approaches and your interests in creating this exhibition? What does that mean to both of you? That's just a general question. But I think that the other thing that has struck me in both presentations really is this idea around the age of man. You know, that just how much we are changing this, what you call the landscape that we live on, a landscape that has been changed naturally through, of course, natural activities, earthquakes, and so on and so forth, and that which we've inhabited as human beings in that state for a little bit of time. And now, through what you are seeing here, actively changing this thing and changing it both by new materials, things like concrete and steel and aluminium, but then also changing it by the way that we're building up and digging down. So this idea of extracting and building, and this human sort of need or interest to change things, to plant ourselves here is an interesting question. We haven't seen so many people in your exhibition, and that I know is just a slice of the depth of work that you're doing, because some of the things that you showed us on the screen were now beginning to show us people loving color, people wanting a certain lifestyle, people making choices. But in this one, I think I was brought back to what you just shown us, which is this very elemental nature of where this process of construction and building and creating civilization starts. That it starts with a matrix that is stone, a matrix that is soil. It is the Earth's crust. And very interesting to see how we actually colonize the Earth in a sense, as you see human beings cutting this thing and trying to shape it and live in it and inhabit it. There is a sense of a species that colonizes. And I think it brings us to discussion around, are we colonizing in a sustainable way? Or are we colonizing in a way that will destroy both that matrix and ourselves ultimately? So I thought that was interesting in the connection. But I think the other thing was this notion of the accidental city. Indeed, the railway gets to where it gets to, and then suddenly you're like, whoops, how do we deal with this? And then we create a depot and we begin to create a city. And from moving from accidental city to what I'm calling a city of many intentionalities, which I see in your work, many aspirations, this block, that block, my block is falling apart, my block is better than your block, my block is in the rural area. So this idea of trying to create Nairobi now, but again, not creating it in any coherent way, but in many intentionalities, I think is something that strikes me there as well. But then I think ultimately it's this notion of transcendence in a sense, elevation, that the elevation is not just to build and to build the tallest, but maybe that the human being is aspiring towards something. How do we overcome and even transcend this geography, this matrix, this materiality in a sense? But we're always pulled back down to it. And your exhibition forces us to look at certain things very keenly and to think about them. And I think that your interest in this material of stone is a very interesting for us also personally, because we've been looking at the materiality of the thing we're trying to build. And there's been the discussion around, of course, reducing carbon emissions, but also how do you work with the stone? How do you work with the thing that is home, that is beneath our feet, that is Nairobi? So thank you. I think a wonderful coming together of both practices, even though they seem like they're not the same, but there is something that I'm finding is a glue there. So those are my first sort of, just to throw it out there so that people can ask their questions. And then I'd ask Garnet to also ruminate a little bit on what she hears, just to give us a sense of, again, how people are responding and reacting to what's there and what they've heard today, so that we can then open it up to discussion. Garnet.
Nice to come here.
Come forward, yeah. And we have no mic today, so.
Oh, okay, so that's good. All right, now first I want to say thank you to all of you for just provoking so much thought, by the discussion. I'm a Nairobian, and so when I first saw the exhibition, or when we first spoke, with James and Connie, and they were talking about the high-rise buildings. When I first came to Nairobi, I lived in Lower Kabete. And back then, Lower Kabete was not the suburb that you now know. It was Gishagi. And one of the things that I remember we used to aspire to, and we came to school, to Nairobi to school, on the country bus, with all the potatoes and the sacks and the women coming to bring their wares to the city. One of the things, we lived in bungalows, and we used to long to live in what was then called a flat. Why? Because there were stairs in the flat. And, we kind of felt, the bungalow is not, far from the hut, from the rural area where our parents came from. And so when we went home, it was to a kind of a bungalow. And so suddenly you're giving us all these pictures of, the high rise and, the aspirational. And for me, I still remember, you talked about KICC when you're talking about the city. And I think first year was the Hilton. And this was the tallest building in the city. And we used to go to town to look at the Hilton because it was actually touted as the tallest building in the city and as a sign of our progress. We were becoming modern. And then we did KICC, and now that was the ultimate, okay? And because KICC, somebody said, that Kenyatta designed the top as a hut. So, people really felt that now this was a symbol, of possibility, where we were going. And for the longest time, again, it was the tallest building. And then they started going taller. And I think, it's probably very interesting hearing what you're saying about the base. Because historically, we used to be told that, Nairobi was a swamp. And for me, when you have a swamp, and I know these areas, beyond that already towards Karen, where it's still swamp. And, one of the things they say is, you really cannot build there easily. You have to put your building up on stilts or whatever, because, the instability. But, now I'm thinking, oh my goodness, you mean there's so much rock you can build anywhere, you can build anything anywhere? I mean, I don't know. So, things are shifting in my head as you go along, because there is parts of Nairobi where I really did imagine that you could not build tall buildings because of the nature of the foundation of the city. And so I'm very encouraged, because I used to worry about the tall buildings, but I used to think, maybe they're collapsing because people are not paying attention to the fact that there's instability beneath. And you talked about the rivers and all that, but that we can build properly for stability. And this brings me back. Connie wrote a book and she came here to launch it recently. And it's called Nairobi in the Making. And one of the things that she actually did find when she was studying Nairobi was that, and I'm quoting you here, the unpredictable trajectories of official yet opaque urban planning. And I remember sticking to this because, Connie, since you were last here, the word opaque has got new meaning for us Kenyans, okay? But still, that whole problem of planning, that, for you, the worry that buildings are collapsing because of a failure in paying attention to the things that officially we need to pay attention to. So for me, again, you're just confirming what you found in 2014, when you're doing initial research. But the other thing that has happened, since you were away, while you were away, is that, you talked about the formal and the informal, okay? And, that is seen again in the way that we build, not as binary opposites, but linked and often mutually constitutive. And for me, this is again clear in the ways in which you have looked at the buildings, that we have a huge urban population now, but how are they managing to survive in the city? What are they putting out? What are they being drawn to? What are the advertisers? What I saw something there about selling this lifestyle. What kind of lifestyle are we being sold? What kind of lifestyle can we afford within the city? And so for me, these things come up very, very powerfully in your exhibition. And of course, you did identify even then as, most of us live in the hustle economy. Right now, that is actually our philosophy, official philosophy. And when you wrote it then, she put it in quotation marks. Now it's official. Yeah, now it's official. So I kept thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know if you know how prescient your work was. But for me, totally, totally fascinating. But coming back to the Rift Valley, I think it's about 3 years ago. I think we had rains, and suddenly the earth opened up in Suswa, and buildings disappeared. People's homes were swallowed up. And when we talk about those movements of the plates and the kind of what you call precarity in which we live, because of nature, as well as because of nurture. For me, the information you've given is really, in terms of helping us to plan, is really, really then urgent. Because suddenly I'm thinking Nairobi is a city which you can build. We've got solid foundation. We can. So we'll stop worrying about the high rise, which I have been worrying about. Well, I don't know. Not yet. Not yet. No. Well, I don't know. Okay, I'll put it out there. Maybe we should worry together or not about the high rises, because foundationally, we now know that we are rock solid. No, that's what I was hearing from over there, thinking, oh, what a relief. Okay. Anyway, so I will not say more than that, but just to say that thank you so much for all the provocation, and thank you so much, because I know I sit at the Go Down Art Center with Joy, who studied architecture. And one of the things I've also been really interested in is looking for stone, because we've been building something and looking for colored stone. You know, we were told about the blue stone, but now I know about the pink stone, the green stone, and that you can actually build with it. So for me, an education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe before you respond to those, two questions from the audience,
Yeah.
from our
Online.
online audience. Both are for one architect here. They're asking, for the Vienna court, was it structural stone that you used, or was it a cladding, or was it both? That's one question. And the other is, did the use of the stone result in any cost savings?
Yeah, okay. So two very specific questions.
Yeah.
Sadly, no, the answer wasn't structural stone. And that's, I think, one of the deficiencies is that what's happening in Nairobi is that stone, which has this beauty and this color and this integrity, is being sliced down to small pieces, and then it's being stuck onto buildings effectively. So it's a form of cladding. And so in that particular case, as much as we would have liked, it is a concrete frame structure, which is finished looking stone. What we are now doing is trying to investigate the logistics, the potential of actually building load-bearing stone, which is something that we've talked to James and Connie about. So we hope that in future we will be taking blocks, monolithic blocks of stone, which have this color, being able to carry the load of the building in a structural form, and then being able to dress that as well as a finish. So, and the second question was, sorry, it was
Cost savings. Yeah.
cost savings. I mean, I think the material is local. So when we look at the cost of the material that's being quarried locally and brought to your site locally, it's cost effective. What is the cost of? I think it's probably a similar cost to plastering your building and painting it in acrylic paint. I think it's just there's a process of executing it. So maybe there's a slight increment to that, but it's fairly comparable. So I think that it's a strong argument that people should be looking at using stone much more, because I don't think cost is an impediment. Shouldn't be.
Thank you. Okay, I will respond directly to the question of collaboration. I've collaborated quite a few times in the past in my work with people who are coming from very, very different disciplines, whether it's health or anthropology or very pure science. But there's two aspects to collaboration and sort of that cross-pollination of ideas. So one of them is very technical in terms of the framework. How do you build a framework that works for both disciplines? And the other one is in terms of content. How do you develop then? How do you come up with content or material that actually, is working for both of the different parties that are together? So in terms of the framework, Connie is coming from University of Manchester, and obviously institutions, most institutions have very specific structures that they work under, and key to that is planning way ahead. This project were meant to start before COVID, but structurally, when COVID comes in, some things have to be agreed by the infrastructure before they can be put to ground. So we in a way had to sort of negotiate that, and I think the key term here is a bit of fluidity, so that as much as those structures are rigid, then there are structures that are created by us humans. So it's quite possible to re-engineer those structures and make them work for us. Now, in terms of content, we are all human. So in many ways, we identify things in very similar ways. Whether it's aesthetics, things that are aesthetically appealing to us, we identify it very similarly. We might approach them from very different angles, but the end sort of what we're aiming for is very, very similar. And that's what we're able to employ, so that we, when we say, okay, I like this, but why do we like it? Sometimes there's no reason, sometimes there's no logic to things, but we still like it, So it's negotiating those sort of soft bits of ourselves as humans. Then how do we then say, look, you like it, I like it, we don't really have a reason, we can figure out that later. Then let's work with that, But then also, Connie has worked a lot with images. So he's very sort of conversant with observing, and I mean, we all are. But when you are deliberate about looking at people, it's very different from just observing. And on my end, I've looked at information that is generated from academic structures quite a bit. So I'm very conversant to that. And that helps in terms of understanding where the other person might be approaching an idea from and where might be approaching an idea from. But importantly, we have to be a little different. We have to have, we cannot agree in everything. And that's very important because when we agree on everything, I think there's something wrong.
I'm going to disagree now. No. Yeah, so maybe just starting with this question of collaboration. I mean, you said a lot of it. I think you're very research oriented. I worked in the past a lot with visual methods. So we have that overlap, I guess. We have a bit of a Venn diagram going on in our practice. But yeah, importantly, we're also working in very different media. So I think for me, as a social anthropologist, within the social sciences, anthropology is normally regarded as a very open-ended discipline, unlike some other disciplines which maybe are much more kind of hypothesis-oriented or problem-oriented. Anthropology is very critical. It doesn't necessarily have to find a resolution. So I fondly saw myself as this very open-ended person who was quite flexible in the directions that my thinking went, and I was ready to be led by what I found in the research. But frequently, James has brought me up short and said, no, you're being too literal. No, this is too representational. So I've also had to learn to park my interest in narrative, in finding answers, in telling one single story. I think, so that for me has been a big learning, is to be, you know, that for you guys, you know, you are the ones who are finding the narrative, finding the story, contributing to the creation really of the exhibition by the way that you see and interpret and react to what we kind of put forward as a provocation, maybe. So that's been a really interesting process. Maybe I can just say a bit about some of the other things you mentioned, Joy. So I think what you said about intentionality, I think is really a key aspect for me in my work in this project, but also more broadly, is how do we maintain that commitment to people's experiences, to their intentions, to hopes, to aspirations, whilst also really maintaining our critical faculties about things like politics, economics, structural inequality, the legacies of colonialism, and keeping these kind of structure agency questions in a productive tension, I think for me is really important. So I think that definitely is the kind of bedrock, if you like, to a lot of my interest in this area. But I think also for me, and I think also for you as well, in our interest in materials, is also this is to remember that these kinds of effects are not solely human. So that we live in this era now, so scientists, geologists have named our era, this geological era of the Anthropocene. So we live in this time of human influence change. So we're creating our own strata now in the geological record, which is made up of processes of urbanization, of concrete, of all of these new materials that we created. But I think it's important to remember that Anthropocenic change, we're not the sole actors in that geological strata. So I think for me, my interest in this part of the work in Upper Hill is this reminder that there are these other processes at work, which are ecological, which are animal, which are microbial, to do with waste and decay and the other kinds of life that can occupy cities. So for me, it's that kind of tension, I think, between the human and the non-human that I find really productive. And the kind of frictions, you know, that's not an easy relationship or a smooth relationship. You know, as Bashar was saying, you know, we look at like the consequences of using aluminium and concrete. These are extremely active materials in the sense of changing climate, in the sense of their long-term consequences. So we have to think about those tensions of the relationships that we make between each other, but with materials in these processes.
I will assist in the moderation and the question. Or shall I ask you to come next? Just so that I can then take 3 and then 3 and then 3. So we've got 1, 2. We have a third one. Let's take those 2 first.
Okay, I have a bunch of thoughts, but first I'd just like to say thank you very much for sharing your work and your passions for this. I'm comforted because I've had a career built out of thinking about very similar things. So most recently, I've been tasked with advising Nairobi City Council on implementing our climate action plan, and we're starting conversations around the labor impact of a transition to green construction. So really interesting to hear about, the sort of embodied emissions in some of these materials. But I started my career selling real estate, I should say marketing real estate. And I, through that process, was very challenged to further my knowledge in urban planning because I was selling luxury. At a time when a lot of funny money was moving around Nairobi, I guess you could argue it still is. And so there were dynamics around our real estate market that were grounded in fundamentals that I understood. We have a land market that operates, but we also have those aspirations. Of course, Upper Hill is one of the most expensive parts of the city. Its proximity to the CBD, but I don't know what the calculation was that says we need to be toilets. And not all real estate in Nairobi can be luxury real estate. At some point we have to talk about affordability. My question would be around the use of those materials or the dynamics around land markets. Is what's most responsible for it going up, and the design choices that are made? Is it policy? Is it materials? Is it economics? I guess as one of the thoughts around this, but really, really interesting. And I know we probably talk about this at great length, but in your opinions, what affects are the prices the most, or the billboards? But they're now in dollars.
So we'll take the second one.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. My name is Peter Achayo. So very interesting thoughts. But first of all, maybe let me just throw it back there. That why is it that we do not have the main players who make decisions about how our developments look like, architects and developers? Really in this conversation. So then, if there are any thoughts or ideas, then we know that from tomorrow hence, we can begin to see some implementation. Otherwise, then do this just remain beautiful thoughts and discussions and discourse for us, But I guess maybe Joy or yourselves, you will know how to deal with that. But tied to that very closely is within your practices. Are you involved in working with developers or architects in architecting, these new developments as we see them coming along? And so my mind quickly goes to, as much as we're talking about construction and all this, going vertical, there's also the construction happening in vast parts of the city, particularly the historical sites in Eastlands, and as that is happening, there's a lot of history that's embodied in those developments. And as we're going to create new developments to replace those, are those part of discussions that you involve with the developers? So that as we're doing that, then we begin to also then ask ourselves questions of aesthetics, of our history, of our culture, that then can inform the design, of those developments as they are coming. So these are very current, and he's from Nairobi County. You're saying you're advising them?
Yeah.
So they are the whole NMS projects that I think sort of like they haven't been signed, but perhaps then this would be a very interesting time to then probe if there are areas where those could be discussed. But then lastly, as we're talking about, there is the shortage of land and the pressure around land that exists today. So perhaps that's the main, and the value of land, the cost of land. Why we're projecting going skywards. But I saw a very interesting story this past week, I believe in Miami and in the Florida area, where people who bought these sort of like townhouses and mansions, there is only so far you can rise if you're sort of like doing some expansion or redevelopment, because their heights and views are controlled. And so cleverer people are choosing to go further down, into the ground. And now guess what has happened? They're actually beginning to check on that as well because of shifts and fears that there'll be shifts in the tectonic plates or whatever it is that happens beneath the earth. So I'm just wondering, at what point are we going to get there, in this city where we're beginning to think, okay, if we can't go too high, or even as much as we're going high, can we also then begin to see how much we can use the real estate that's below the ground? My last thought is to you. As you're talking about stone, I mean, how about beautiful terracotta? Which really, from a material perspective, we've used it historically, and structures stand today, whether you look at the Great Wall of China, the Benin City, of legend, where they use art very, very well. And those structures stand many, many hundreds of years to date. And I wouldn't sit down without mentioning that Diablo Francis Gehry, has really shown us that, we can use this and build in all these bioclimatic conditions, within the structure, make it look beautiful, dignify it, even as we are addressing the all important, sometimes driving factor of material and space use that define the cost of the building, where developers are all they're looking for is ROI. But then maybe if we're beginning to think about these sort of materials, that they can be able to check on the cost and eventual pricing of the buildings. Thank you.
Okay, now we both have another one in between. That's a lot. But you'll be next. Yeah. So who wishes to start to respond? We had Jenga with what do you think is responsible for the driving up? And I think that's just spoken to that similarly as well. And I think you can both, respond from both sides because you both have opinions in that.
Why don't you start?
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Well, I think that perhaps the easy one, if I can start with that, is the question about brick and clay. And I think you're absolutely right. It's beautiful, valid, contextual material that we can and should be using. And we've built in brick, but in Kampala, where in Kampala it's much more prevalent. I should say that Francis Gehry's last building in Turkana, I don't know if you saw the learning center, was actually built in stone. And then it was rendered in an acrylic render. So it's actually a stone building as well. And I think the approach we would adopt is we look to materials that are available locally. And whilst brick is available locally, it's just a little bit more complicated than the stone, because you've got to cook brick. You've got to burn it in a kiln in order for it to gain its strength. And if you look at the cost and the process, that's just a bit more complex than stone, which is, as you can see behind you, just incredibly abundantly available. So that might answer a little bit to the reason why we look at stone in place of clay. But we of course, we can build in clay in Nairobi, is something we will do. And we've looked at ground earth as well, which is a technology that we'd like to investigate. To talk to the issues of how buildings are being conceived and built, I think one of the issues in Kenya is that housing is being built by the private sector. So if you look at the government's affordable housing program, certainly in 2017 when it was launched, I think the target was 500,000 units or something to that effect. And from what I understand, about 5,000 units were actually built. So that's 1%. And that was, I think, with public-private, some kind of public participation. So I think that when the private sector is dictating what housing should look like, private sector entirely is dictating what housing should look like, you're left to the ambitions of a developer. And it's up to their perception what a building should look like. And I think it's interesting that you've got images on the screen of what these interiors look like, because I imagine that's what they perceive to be attractive to the market. And so I think that if the discussion was a bit broader, and if end users were involved in that discussion, and if stakeholders in government were involved in that discussion, and it was more collaborative, then perhaps you might see different outcomes being realized. And there are so many complexities in building, because in Nairobi, you have to look at land values, which are very, very high, given the development of the city. The city is 100 years old. You have to look at the cost of building, the fact that we don't make very many materials that are embedded into a house. In Kenya, twins, for example. Glass is not manufactured in East Africa. It's imported from the Far East or from the Middle East. And so cost of construction is higher than it perhaps could be. So I think that the complexity of how you build is left to the private sector. And I think they then determine what they think works best. And I think it was Peter. I think you talked about many more ideas in housing. What should housing look like? What should it represent? What is the embodied carbon in housing? How does it serve the needs of young families, for example? Where is the green space, the recreation space? These are all questions that I think we have to answer, we have to think about. And I think that the challenge for architects and designers and anthropologists, artists, is to engage in these discussions so that we can think more carefully about how we do things differently in the future.
Thanks. Yeah, I think both your sets of questions actually overlap really nicely. So absolutely agree with all that's just been said, but maybe just to say a little bit more about land. So obviously land is one of the preeminent issues in Kenya regions, whether that's rural land or urban land, whether it's ancestral land, whether it's privately marketed land, whether it's public land. Of course, we all know that so much of the dynamics that shape both physically the spaces we live in, but also our politics, comes back to questions of land in really, really vital ways. And I think, yeah, absolutely, a lot of the processes of change that we see in Nairobi at the moment, this kind of rapid expansion of high-rise building definitely comes back to rising land values. So, I mean, as part of the kind of wider project that this exhibition and this collaboration is part of, I've been doing some work in neighbourhoods like Umoja and looking there at this shift from, you know, these single-story sort of courtyard structures that were built in the 1970s and 80s, and then now, you know, those, not even the whole courtyard, but the single-room dwellings of that 6 or 7 rooms that make up that courtyard are being sold off, and a 5-story garoffa built on that tiny footprint of 1 room. And that, of course, is being driven by escalating rental values, by urbanisation, more people coming in, and also the you know, also the affordability of materials that, you know, prices currently going up, but over the longer term, the capacity to import building materials has got a lot cheaper, and those kinds of it's become much more accessible to do that kind of construction. In terms of the markets and the way that this operates, I think Garnet mentioned some of my previous work, which has been very much looking at these issues, and so we're all obviously now very familiar with this word opaque, but that's not only the word of 2022. I'd say it goes back, you know, to certainly to the colonial era and then post-colonial politics as well. And so I called this in some of my other work. I call
So you know, even the point where it's during the struggles, everybody will talk about that. And I think in a lot of my work at Genesis, I'm interested in that what it means, and you know, and I think other works that is an important place where okay, got the land, but then what do you do with it? Past what you know change has been to transform land not into agriculture, very sort of hand-to-mouth sort of use where you know you farm and you get your building material from there, whether it's grass or soil to make bricks, and you to that space, and that becomes your new land of value. But having said that, I think he has something to do with, you know, how do we influence whether it's aesthetics or the quality of life and all that. And two things. One must not underestimate the value and the place of aspirations for people, especially people who have the money to invest in something. You know, they aspire towards, especially things that they have seen. So they might go to an architect and say, look, create for me this and that, and they put down their ideas and all that. And the architect will come up with something from, you know, the intellectual knowledge. But then, you know, this person, since, you know, they have the money and everything, they will absolutely trash that idea and say, no, I don't want this, I want this, I want this, I will build this. And I can guarantee you more than 50% of buildings you see in this city are not actually designed by architects. Maybe there was one design that has been copy-pasted, you know, over the years, you know. So I do think as much as we have the privilege of thinking about material and wanting to impress on others that this is a good way, this is a responsible way to be, there's still that other character who is actually the money and who is the person that is actually going to make this happen. And then other things follow on, like corruption. You know, you can have a building designed for 5 floors, but you go there, you build 8 floors and pass money here and there. You know, capital, you know, the idea of sort of who can buy what and who values what is such a powerful phenomenon that we must not ignore, despite our sort of knowledge and saying, oh, we can do this, we can do this, it's responsible. We must not ignore that social dimension of what capital means.
Yeah. We'll take the last set of questions. Yeah. So I've got one on paper. Then the young lady had her hand up, and then you have your hand up as well. But there was a question that was asked, and I will just see whether Mandeep would wish to respond to Garnet was very taken by Basharat's presentation of the geology of Nairobi, the Nairobi area, and now comforted that we can build anywhere and everywhere. Mandeep is the excavation contractor of the Go Down site, a wonderful guy. He knows the ground very well. That is the business he's in. Keeps digging it and digging it and digging it. Maybe you want to say something about the things that we find.
Yes, I've noted that the lady here said that we are sitting on very stable ground. It's good for building and all that. But I've done excavations in real time, not an investigation. But we've done excavations 20 meters deep into the ground where there's solid hard rock from the top, and at negative 20 meters, we come to completely soft soil.
Yeah.
And the pictures of the pinnacle you have also has the same issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's why that construction has stopped where it is, because the ground is not stable. They tried piling, but they haven't yet come to a solution. So, it's different that way. So those are the main things I've noted. People think differently, but in real time, what there is also not what we see. People are racing for high-rise buildings because of money. But Nairobi also lies adjacent to the Rift Valley, where we've got the fault line and all that. But I don't know when this thing will happen, which year. But I think people should also prepare themselves for that sort of scenario that will happen that time. That's all I have to tell you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think maybe collectively, so we might have given an impression about the idea that somehow
Nairobi's rock solid.
Nairobi is rock solid, and because we're interested in stone, somehow it indicates stability. And I think in all kinds of different ways, I think our work has been certainly very interested in the geological and the questions of stone, but precisely because the city is very precarious in different kinds of ways. So we see it in terms of material kind of precarity, as we see with these series of collapses that have occurred over the last 10, 15 years to devastating effects. But we also see it in terms of social and economic precarity as well. And so the ways in which this happens at different levels, so you look at estates like Pipeline, for example of this, where you have these materially attractive and
surveys. It means geotechnical analysis. It means understanding if there's underground water. So it's far more complex than looking at Nairobi, and we can build these, we probably can, interpretation. They're hurt. Lots of discussions on color and texture and green space. You're dealing with essentially providing a roof over someone's head. I think it's really interesting looking at this audience over here, because I wonder what the average age is. The average age, does anyone know what the average age is here today? I know that within the country, it's about 18 to 19 years. And the UN projects that from a population of about 5 million people today in Nairobi, by 2100, Nairobi will have, they argue, they debate between 40 and 50 million people. How do 40 to 50 million people live in a city like Nairobi? That's the entire population of the country today, now living in the city. And Dar es Salaam's even worse, and Kampala similar. So I think that when you talk about the basic requirements of living in a space and shelter, then I think that we've got to really think about what are we going to be doing for the next 20, 30, 40 years in housing. And hopefully it's very well designed with good engineers so that buildings don't come down.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for those. So let's take those two questions plus this one, and then I think we'll wrap it up. Yeah, kindly.
Hi. So the material story of everything is very interesting for me, and I like that the guy from the paint company. So the paint stones and didn't insist on painting them. So I was in a lecture, and this guy was doing research on the tensile strength of materials, and he said that compressed art blocks from his research are just as strong or even stronger than like a lot of the materials that we use for building. Yet people still, and I think then he said they were cheaper to a big extent because they were being kind of like upcycled. And so the question I wanted to ask, which I feel like James kind of spoke on, was what's your observation on how people choose the materials that they use? I would assume that the logical process would be, cost benefit, so what's the cost of this material? And then maybe aesthetic as the next thing. But then one of the things that we ended up discussing a lot was someone uses like a very beautiful stone and then they plaster it and cover it up, and it could be, you know, like it's very aesthetic. Or so if you wanted to cover it up, then maybe you should have used the cheaper, you know, like the cheaper material and covered it up if you want the aesthetic to be, you know, the concrete. So what's your observation and what's your analysis, both to the architect and the visual observers, on what influences people in such positions in building?
Thank you for that. Let's take the second one.
Good evening, everyone. I just ask that you look at your neighbor for a second. Each one of us in this room today has a shirt on, okay? And each of our shirts, they're not the same. I'm here representing Kenya Property Developers Association. I'm with my colleague Steven, is the head of research. He's the guy with the facts. For me, I have questions and a lot of opinion. So we are very glad that we're being hosted by a developer. That is the Go Downs, the part of our membership. And you raised the question that where are the developers? We are having all these conversations, but the guys who actually implement them are not on the table. So developers, they don't work in isolation. They're not aligned. You have the architects to consult from, they have project managers, they have engineers, they have the contractors, and all these people come together to give you a house. But at the end of the day, if anything fails, we all go back to the developer. Right? As much as you are asking all these questions, we should also be asking, as an architect who is part of AK, as a quantity surveyor, part of IQSK, what is it being done at that level to ensure that when the house is finally delivered, it is of quality and it has met the standards of today and even of the future. Just a quick one. I'll say that as people, we are very aesthetic. So if you're to walk out today and you find two buildings, one will be very big, very spacious, the other will be very tiny, but you'll want the beautiful one without looking into, you know, the space over your head, how much space you have in the kitchen or in the room. Because you want, when you bring your friend, the first thing they notice is how beautiful your dwelling area is. Okay, so are we trading aesthetics for durability and for quality and maybe, you know, strength and all of that stuff? The question about affordable housing, it has been mentioned that we have a very young age, and at the end of the day, you'll have to move out of your parents' house, and you'll have the need to be housed. Okay, so the government is considering that. That's why you're getting that there's so much push around affordable housing to try and house the young population that is getting out of universities and out of colleges year in, year out. It is not an effort to try and offer the best. It is an effort to provide the need that is housing. You know, we grew up knowing that you need to have food, you need to have shelter, you need to have that. The two have been provided for long term, but then housing was forgotten. It is time that now we are thinking, by the way, you know what? Houses are actually, we have 10 people living under one roof with only one toilet or two, if you're lucky to have a master bedroom that is en suite. So the government is engaging us as KPDA to try and offer more. But then we are asking them, zoning has taken so long. You are in Kilimani, a house is constructed today that was a bungalow or maybe a 2-floor townhouse. And the next thing that is erected is not a residential housing. It is a mall or something of that sort. Okay, so you are competing against people who have billions, and you as a developer, you only have what can afford to build maybe 20 units of 3-bedroom, and you see that the prices of land is skyrocketing. It is not by default, it is by design that zoning has taken so long to be actually actualized. So if you have a planner here, maybe this can be out to you as TC Park. You need to engage the government. We need to clearly state where the residential area is, where the commercial area is, because you cannot have different commercial asset classes competing for the same commodity that is land. The price will always be different. There's a reason why Upper Hill is so highly valued. It was considered more of a commercial area. But then we also have why Kilimani is currently rising in terms of prices because we have people coming in and actually erecting commercial houses where initially been zoned as residential areas. And lastly, just to mention about the matter of time and cost and how the developers have to deal with it. Development, we have PPP. The government does social housing. The private tries to do affordable housing. So all of this cost is taken into an individual. It can be Joy, it can be myself, it can be him. So at the end of the day, you see about ROI. These guys are looking into having a margin that can actually make him stay in business for long and continue to, deliver quality. But that is not the case as of today. You start building today. You have a budget of 1 billion. By the time it hits next year, you're halfway your project. The other half will also need another 1 billion. This developer goes into debt, completes one building and surrenders. We don't have any more buildings that will be coming up. So I'm asking of us as guys who are in the development sector, don't leave it to us, the developers. If an architect will go to the government, tell them, by then my clients are not coming as they used to be. A quantity surveyor goes and complains. We love the prices and all these other things being rational and being moderated. So it's a plea to all of you. Let us not blame the developers. Let us have a combined effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And then the last question is from somebody over here who says, I've heard that building materials produce radioactive elements, which in the long term may have may be a health hazard. Is this true? So are there any building materials that in your practice and you've encountered that are radioactive?
Uranium.
Yeah.
Granite, yeah. I think that probably that question is slightly easier, so I might take that one. Which is that I've not encountered materials that are emitting any radioactive material in Kenya. So it's something that's fairly new to me. So I wouldn't imagine that's an immediate pressing concern, and certainly not with natural stone, which has been used for thousands of years.
If I may add to that, the only material that I know in the past was, I think it was banned now, asbestos. It was very much used. Well, not radioactive, but toxic.
Carcinogenic.
Yeah, as well as some lead in some of the roofing materials. So when you start collecting rainwater, you have to be careful what roofing material, So not radioactive, but yeah, toxic.
Yeah, and I think also we should be concerned about other kinds of toxicity as well. So if we're talking about climate change, then thinking about materials like concrete, as in the concrete industry contributes something like 3 times what the aviation industry contributes to in terms of their carbon footprint. So thinking about those kinds of very long-term, slower sort of toxic processes is important as well. So coming back to the question about who's in the conversation, and that, I think the last set of comments raised a really important point about how buildings, urban development, urbanization is very much a network of processes, and that you can't apportion blame or agency or affect to one particular person or thing or institution in that network. So I think it comes back, sorry, Peter, to your question before as well about, where are the other people in the conversation? So I think I also just wanted to say we definitely don't see this as a sort of standalone event. It's one iteration of a bigger project. We're also doing this as part of Placemaking Week, which is a whole week of having these kind of conversations. And we were here the other day with members from the county and from Nakuru Special Planning Area, having a different kind of conversation, but one very much related to these themes. It's also Urban October. So there's a multitude of conversations and debates happening at, can we say, different levels, different aspects of these kinds of issues. And I think, we feel happy to be able to make an intervention into that set of debates. I don't think we feel like we have answers, but we hope that it provides, a slightly different angle to perhaps more legal frameworks or technical frameworks that are obviously essential and need to be worked through, but we can provide a way of opening up the conversation to make people think a bit differently about materials or about different other kinds of processes.
I hope that is a response, because of course, we can all continue conversations and there'll be more responses as we exchange. But I hope that the panelists have at least given you their perspectives from their experiences as best as they can within this short time. I'd like to say thank you at this point to Connie and James, first of all, for agreeing to have this exhibition, and then in your explorations for discovering Kujenga Group and inviting them to be a part of this discussion. So thank you very much, Basharat and Inaya, for joining us. Then, of course, to thank everybody who joins the conversation by being present, asking questions, and continuing the conversation after the formal one over here. So thank you very much for attending. And Nairobitians who are here on Wednesday, thank you again for coming back. I hope that you are picking up some good learning and also some good connections and some good conversations in the process. So thank you very much for doing that and for coming. Connie mentioned, and I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of Placemaking Week. So Placemaking Week will end tomorrow. There is one last event that you're all invited to. This is a parade that is going to happen at the city center. It will start at 10 o'clock tomorrow, City Hall area, City Hall Way. So come in and join in and parade and get to know your city. And to get to know other people who love the city and have questions around the city and interact with the city. We will also be doing an event, which is walking with a group of young women around a certain portion of the city, just so that they can begin to appreciate how a design that they've made in another part of the city is beginning to be reflected in this part, and whether they still have different ideas around the designs they've come up with. Yeah, so there'll be a number of things happening tomorrow. And then there'll be entertainment and performance at the end of that particular parade. So karibuni to that as well. That is all free. Now, on the last note, because we have students, and I don't want to embarrass you, I think you're here with your teachers. You're actually officially on a school trip. So I've been told that while there are refreshments after this, the students to kindly stay away from the booze. Let it not be said that the go down made you drunk on a school trip. On another day when we have an exhibition that is completely open and you're here not on a school trip, you're quite free to do whatever you need to do. But today I think we will ask your teachers to, and we'll respect their wish that the students stay sober as part of their student trip. But there's lots of juice and other things, so enjoy those as well. But I think on behalf of Connie and James, this was actually their conversation. It's been our pleasure to be able to host it here. To thank you and to thank once again Ambassador Dinaya for bringing this conversation to us. Thank you all very much. And now we have the exhibition. Enjoy it. There's a small room in there where there's more to be seen. We will actually clear these chairs so that you can enjoy the rocks. Be careful with those stones. If they fall in a toe, some of them are very heavy. So yes, so we will then pull you away from there, and they'll be spotlighted so that you can enjoy them as objects and a point of meditation. And we'll bring back the other piece that sits on this screen. But stick around, have some refreshments, have some conversations. Asante sana. Thank you.